So in this video, I'm going to deal with who is potentially the author of the Gospel of Matthew and where this author may have been living or where his audience may have been living as well. And then in the next video that I'll create, I will talk about timing, when the Gospel may have been written, and also about why, the purposes of it. So we'll begin here about who wrote it. Of course, one of the things that a lot of people think of when they see the Gospel of Matthew is they think about it being Matthew, an apostle of Jesus. But our title was affixed sometime probably in the early second century. This doesn't mean that the Gospel did not circulate with an author already known as it circulated. Might have been quite unusual for the gospel to be circulated and someone not to know who is responsible for it. But a title such as According to Matthew was affixed by the early second century. It seems like this gospel certainly is presenting Jesus, who has sympathies with the kind of Jewishness or Jewish background. This Jesus in Matthew's gospel is someone who says things like, I've come not to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. And there's a number of things in the gospels that the author doesn't have to explain because he seems to be assuming that his audience already knows, such as things have to do with traditions of the Pharisees. These are things that Mark's gospel has to explain to his audience, but this author doesn't seem to need to explain it. So the Jewishness of Jesus, or Jesus in his Jewish context, certainly seems to be appreciated in this gospel more than, say, in Mark's. Someone who belongs to a community that has experienced a close hostility, I should say here, with non-Christian Jews, since it's likely that the this is written to people who are Jewish Christians. And yet we see in this warnings of Jesus, from Jesus, about persecution that is going to be directed towards his Jewish followers, because there's warnings about being thrown out of their synagogues, as if this audience has their own synagogues. And so that means if they're in the synagogues, then they probably are Jewish. It's not that it couldn't be that there might have been Gentiles in Jewish synagogues and following Jesus, and Jewish leadership wants them thrown out. But it does seem like there's going to be some kind of hostility that is anticipated, or likely probably even being experienced by the community. But it does seem highly unlikely that this was written by a Gentile. Most of the scholarship that I'm familiar with on Matthew's gospel, accepts that it was probably written by a Jewish follower of Jesus. And it just doesn't seem to be something that is written by a Gentile believer. Although it's not saying that this is out of the question. It's just that's not typically the viewpoint or the argument of most scholarship on the gospel. In favor of Matthew, a person in the narrative of the gospel who is an apostle, in favor of this, well, certainly there's the church tradition. So we have a saying or a quote from Papias, according to Eusebius, that Matthew the apostle is somehow responsible. I'm going to take a closer look at this piece of evidence that Eusebius provides. So you have to be careful, because Papias, though he may be a early second century Christian author or Christian, it's being preserved for us by Eusebius, who was a 4th century, late 3rd, 4th century author. So, of course, one has to also question the credibility of something in the late 3rd, 4th century to accurately and correctly report something as a quote from someone who lived in the early 2nd century. But nevertheless, we do have this church tradition, according to Eusebius, from Papias. We do have then from Irenaeus, and then we have it in Origen, and then Eusebius himself and Jerome. The quote of Papias from Eusebius goes something like this. Now, Matthew made an ordered arrangement of the oracles in the Hebrew, which probably means Aramaic language, and each one translated it or interpreted it as he was able. Now, the HE stands for the Latin name for Eusebius's work, which is in English church history. So notice carefully about this quote. It says that Matthew made an order arrangement of the oracles. So what we have in the Gospels are a collection of narratives as well as teachings. The book does not look like just oracles. That is a collection of just sayings. So what Papias might be saying is that Matthew had a collection of sayings of Jesus that he wrote down in Hebrew, and then each one, including the author of this gospel, as well as other authors who may have had access to this, and they interpreted or translated them into for their own purposes or for their own gospels. So, but this piece of evidence certainly would be more suggestive of Matthew's gospel being potentially earlier than the others. And while there are different theories about the relationship between Matthew's gospel and Mark and Luke, currently today the consensus of many scholars is that Mark's gospel was written first and that Matthew and Luke had access to Mark. But there is another theory that says that Matthew's gospel was written first and that Mark abridged it, and that Luke had, parts of it, and he then edited it and made it his own, or he added his own unique materials. So, but Papias's this Papias's quote still doesn't even really state clearly that Matthew has written what we have as a gospel. It seems to indicate that what he wrote was something of these oracles. Also in favor of the apostle, the reasons why some will argue that it's Matthew the tax collector, only Matthew would be interested in clearing up the identity of Levi, the tax collector. So in Mark and Luke, there's this tax collector called Levi, but in Matthew's gospel, he is called Matthew. So the question is, why is he called Matthew rather than Levi? And so the theory has been, Matthew wanted to more correctly identify himself and providing his name. So also, someone might argue in favor of Matthew the apostle that if this was written by somebody else and the church simply just wanted to attach it to an apostle to give it some legitimacy or authority, they wouldn't ascribe it to a relatively unknown apostle. We don't know very much about Matthew. The likelihood is that they would have attached it to someone who had greater influence, importance, or significance. So someone like Peter, or someone like a John, or somebody else. But Matthew is relatively unknown. Of course, most of the other apostles are relatively unknown. And if you can have a Gospel of Thomas, who is, doesn't play significantly in, at least in the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we do have a Gospel of Thomas. If someone was willing to put together a Gospel and attribute it to Thomas, why not being able to attribute it to someone like a Matthew? Now, in favor of someone other than Matthew, well, Matthew was an eyewitness of Jesus' ministry. And why would Matthew want to reproduce the account by Mark? So if the general theory that's held by most scholarship is that Mark was written first, Matthew had access to Mark, um, or the author had access to Mark's gospel, um, and then added his own materials. If it was Matthew who was an eyewitness, why would he want to use Mark's gospel, who was not an eyewitness, in order to structure his own gospel? But this may not be that strong, because it certainly can be helpful if Matthew thought the material there that was in Mark, comes from Peter, as the tradition sometimes has suggested about Mark's gospel. He may have thought it was a reliable set of information from which to base his own gospel, but he did feel that some of it needed to be correct because there could be an impression of Jesus from Mark's gospel that Matthew thought was inaccurate. So that's one argument against Matthew the apostle. Another argument against it has been the idea that it's less likely that an Aramaic Jew, assuming that's what Matthew was, who lived in Jerusalem, at least eventually lived in Jerusalem, since that's where the apostles went to when Jesus was executed. Why would someone there have written a Greek gospel? So what we have is Greek. So this is putting aside the Papias information about it being written in Aramaic or being written in Hebrew, a set of oracles. Again, it's not certain that this argument is foolproof, because if Matthew is a tax collector, Matthew well could have been conversant in Greek or been connected to people who was quite skilled in writing in Greek, and may have had some contact with non-Jews that he wanted to influence, so he could be responsible for the construction of a Greek gospel, whether or not his actual hand wrote the Greek or whether or not he had a scribe to write it for him. Also, it is less likely that Matthew the apostle would have such developed perspectives on Christology and ecclesiology, so it's oftentimes assumed or argued that the picture of Jesus that one has in Matthew is more developed than what is in Mark. Of course, this depends on a lot of things. So, for instance, this idea of the virgin conception, that's not in Mark, but it is in Matthew. This idea of Jesus, who is tied up as well with the Father and the Spirit. So you have at the very end of Matthew's Gospel the Great Commission, in which go and baptize everyone in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So some have seen, well, that sounds very Trinitarian language, and so that would be a higher Christology than what you would find in Mark's Gospel. Now, ecclesiology refers to the study of the church, and it is true that only in Matthew's Gospel do you see specific instructions with the use of the word ecclesia, or church. So you will have, say, for instance, the instructions in Matthew 18, or what Jesus says to Peter in Matthew's Gospel about building a church. So this kind of information indicates to some, well, this is an understanding of church that is as a kind of a body, a fixed body of people who are having to organize themselves with disciplinary activities, and that understanding of the church was something that happened much later. I'm not so sure that's very convincing. I think Paul's writings would have preceded Matthew's. Paul seems to have quite a developed view of church, and so I don't see anything in Matthew's gospel that particularly is more developed in terms of its ecclesiology than what we see in Paul's writings. But some have used this to try and say this has to be somebody other than Matthew, the tax collector. Now, some have tried to find kind of a middle ground and say, well, maybe it wasn't Matthew, but rather than being this kind of anonymous Jewish Christian follower of Jesus, maybe, and this is the basis for the tradition, there was a Jewish Christian disciple of Matthew who wrote it and was sent out. And since people knew that it was written by a disciple of Matthew, they make the assumption it was then get attached to Matthew. So in favor of this, then, are several pieces of information that we want to kind of look at here. This Jewish Christian disciple then does have a knowledge of the Hebrew Scriptures. He is working with the Old Testament quite extensively, trying to connect events in Jesus' life with things that one can find in the Old Testament, interpreting those Old Testament in light of the events of Jesus. He also shows greater sensitivity to Jewish traditions. He's not trying to discount them. He's not trying to say Jesus has come to abolish them. Jesus is not antithetical to the law. He's kind of here as a teacher like Moses, who then kind of helps to explain or understand the scriptures. And a disciple of Matthew may be more likely to have used Mark and other sources because that disciple may have not been an eyewitness of Jesus and seeing Mark's gospel as circulating around and being accepted and seeing that there may be some inaccuracies or there may be some impressions about Jesus that are not accurate that he wants to address, and so creates a gospel that should be read, offering a clearer portrait of Jesus. Also, he could have reworked this Matthew's Aramaic testimony into Greek. So if Papias' statement can be accepted as accurate, that Matthew did write down in oracles or sayings, he could have taken those sayings of Jesus and then worked them into this kind of body of traditions, stories, these narrative about the events of Jesus' life. And he would also have been interested in properly identifying his teacher, this tax collector, Levi tax collector, and who he is, and changing the name to Matthew. Now, where did Matthew's audience live, or who this audience is likely living in what place? Well, some scholars have argued that the gospel was originally written for Jewish followers of Jesus who are living in Galilee. And these people have conflict with Pharisees, which is highlighted in Matthew. That doesn't mean that they're not conflicts with Pharisees. In Mark's gospel, there certainly is, but there is a heightened tension of conflict with Pharisees. And in Matthew's gospel, there's also a focus on Capernaum as this place out from which Jesus has his ministry. Jesus' kind of headquarters is in Capernaum. But again, Mark's gospel has that, but it's just that there seems to be a little bit more about Capernaum. And so the idea is, well, this is because this gospel author is somewhere in this region. But by and large, the view that scholars have who are trying to identify the place where these the audience lived is Syrian and Antioch. It's called Syrian Antioch because there is an Antioch in Turkey, Asia Minor, Antioch Pisidian. And so to distinguish it from that Antioch, we call it Syrian Antioch. Well, this place was very important in early Christianity. It was a significant Hellenistic city. Of course, by the name Hellenistic, I'm referring that it is a Greek city. And it had a sizable Jewish population. And this these Jewish followers of Jesus who lived there were involved in evangelizing Gentiles. So we see this in Acts 11. So after Stephen, who was a Hellenistic Jewish Christian, is martyred, other Hellenistic Jewish Christians flee Jerusalem. Amongst the place that they go to is Syrian Antioch, and we're told that it's in Syrian Antioch that they start sharing the gospel with non-Jews. And so non-Jews are kind of coming in and becoming followers. And this gospel does show interest in non-Jews who come to worship Jesus or taking the message, taking the good news out to non-Jews. Syria is mentioned in Matthew chapter 4, verse 24, to describe a place where Jesus ministered. So this is the only gospel that does that. Again, it's kind of speculating that the reason why it is mentioned is because the author and his audience himself live in Syria. There's also a reference to a stater in Matthew's gospel in discussion of the temple tax. And so noting that this type of currency would have been popular in Syria leads some to think that this is why Syrian Antioch is a good location for what we call province, or where it was written. Also, we see an importance of Peter in the gospel. So after Peter's confession, Jesus tells Peter that he is Cephas, or he is rock, and he gives Peter the keys to the kingdom. And there's a heightened emphasis on Peter after the resurrection. So when the women see the risen Jesus, they're to go and tell Peter and the others. Also, Syrian Antioch was a place that Peter would go to. So we know out of the book of Galatians that Paul talks about an encounter with Peter in Antioch. So anyway, the prominence of Peter in this gospel suggests a connection to Syrian Antioch. Also, Ignatius of Antioch, an early Christian writer, looks like he is familiar with Matthew's gospel and is using the material that one finds in Matthew's gospel. So all that then tends to lead to Syrian Antioch as being the place where this gospel most likely originally circulated before it would have been copied and then sent around lots of other churches. All right, I'm going to stop there with a little bit about who and where of Matthew's gospel.